When I was growing up in my fifth grade history class, we studied ancient Greek civilization and Greek mythology. And I really enjoyed that year because I found the Greek myths so interesting. And the gods and other human and non-human characters were so lively, and they were always getting involved in some kind of drama, like war or romance or going on long adventures and slaying monsters. So many of the myths also seem to contain a moral aspect to them where they taught a lesson about what leads to real happiness and what brings suffering. There were some, like the king of the gods, Zeus, who seemed to get away with just about anything, but the myths always never shied away from depicting the rawness of suffering and tragedy that usually results from any of the non-virtuous actions of killing, lying, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And the myths contained a lot of memorable images and storylines, so I found myself recalling some of them during my meditation sessions. And I'm not advising that people use their meditation in this way, but it seems that the myths made quite an impact on my subconscious mind, kind of like how the fairy tales affect the minds of children growing up in European cultures. So as we know in Buddhism, the afflictions of ignorance, greed, hatred, and they affect all sentient beings in samsara, not just humans. So it's therefore not really surprising that the gods in the Greek myths also suffer from these afflictions, and probably even more so than the human beings. The gods are depicted as making life very difficult for humans who don't go along with their wishes or commands. And one example of this is when the king of the gods, Zeus, punishes Prometheus for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to the humans so that they could emerge out of chaos and darkness and into civilization. So I found it interesting that these myths guided many aspects of Greek mundane and spiritual life from about 3000 BC up until the rise of Plato and the more rational philosophers. And I think they rose up around 500 BC. And these philosophers criticized the myths as basically fiction and the gods' actions as very immoral. So today, to sort of lighten things up, I thought I'd share two or three of the myths and explore them from the aspects of karma and the afflictions. So the first myth, probably everybody here knows King Midas. And this myth is about the tragedy and futility of greed and how true happiness cannot be found in material possessions. Now, King Midas had ruled the country of Phrygia in Asia Minor, and he lived in great luxury in a castle. He had everything a king could wish for and used to spend his days counting his golden coins, sometimes even bathing in them, because he was so obsessed with his money. One day, Midas did a favor for the god Dionysus, who was the god of intoxication and indulgence, and in return, Dionysus granted him one wish. Now, Dionysus actually warned him to think carefully about that wish, but Midas impulsively decided that he wanted for everything he touched to turn into gold. So the next morning when Midas woke up, he reached out to touch his bedside table and it turned to gold, and he was so excited. Then he ran around his house touching everything that he could, and yeah, it all kept turning into gold. But then he became hungry, and he went to the dining room and he reached out for some grapes. But when he touched the grapes, they turned to gold. And then he's like, oh dear. And then he reached out for some water to drink because he was thirsty, and that also turned to gold. And so he started to doubt his wisdom at that point in time. When his daughter, his beautiful young daughter, entered the room, and he was so happy to see her, and he ran up to her and gave her a big hug, and well, you probably know what happened. She turned to gold. And so at that point, he said, all right, please, Dionysus, take back this blessing that has turned into a curse. And so out of compassion, which is a very good Buddhist value, Dionysus decided to take back that blessing, and he told King Midas to wash his hands in a particular river. And when he washed his hands, he could see the gold running out of them down into the river, and that river had a lot of gold in it from that point on. um, so then when Midas got back to his castle, everything had returned to as it was before, and he could finally see and hug his daughter again. So then at that point, he realized that true happiness doesn't lie in just money and things, but being able to express affection for other people. And then he decided to actually share his great fortune with his people. So from then on, he became a very generous and grateful person, and everyone in his kingdom was really sad when he died. So kind of like a Christmas story, this myth teaches that miserliness and selfishness brings suffering, while generosity and altruism brings happiness. And then the next myth that I want to share is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. And this has been called the ultimate tragic love story. But seen from a Buddhist point of view, it's probably better known as the ultimate tragic attachment story. So Orpheus was known as the most talented musician in his times because his father was Apollo, who's the god of music, and his mother was a muse, one of the 9 inspirational goddesses of literature, the sciences, and the arts. Orpheus had a divinely gifted voice and could play the lyre so beautifully that no human or god could resist it. A wood nymph called Eurydice attended one of his performances, and they fell deeply in love and got married. However, there was also a shepherd who was also in love with Eurydice, and he attempted to ambush the couple on their way home, hoping to kill Orpheus and to kidnap Eurydice. So the couple ran deep into the woods to get away from the shepherd, and Eurydice accidentally stepped on a poisonous snake, which bit her, and she soon died afterwards. So Orpheus was understandably overcome with grief, and he decided to visit the underworld to try and persuade the god of the dead, Hades, to allow his wife to return. He sang and he played his lyre until Hades openly wept and allowed Orpheus to lead Eurydice back to the land of the living. There was one stipulation, however. Orpheus could not under any circumstance look back at his wife while he was leading her out of the underworld, and had to wait until she was fully in the light of the surface before looking at her. Orpheus was overjoyed, and he managed to resist looking back at his wife many times. However, his anticipation grew stronger and stronger the closer they got to the surface of the earth, and as soon as he stepped into the sunlight, he looked back and turned around to embrace her. But unfortunately, Eurydice was still in the shadows of the underworld and hadn't yet reached the sunlight. She was immediately dragged back down, and this time Hades refused to let her go. Orpheus was completely devastated, and he wandered around all day and night in total despair. Other women tried to console him, but he shunned their contact, preferring to be alone and to just stare at the sky. So a group of these women became very irate and decided to take revenge on his rejection by tearing his body into pieces and throwing them and his lyre into a river. His soul descended down to Hades, where he was finally reunited with his wife. So when I first read this myth of Orpheus, I thought that the stipulation was so cruel that he couldn't turn around to make sure that she was really there. And somehow it stuck with me all these years. And now thinking about this myth from a Buddhist perspective or a spiritual perspective, I think that this myth is about the value of renunciation and how the pleasures of this life only bring misery, yet we are often unable to break free of the control that they have over our lives. And we continually sabotage our own wish for happiness by giving into habitual patterns of ignorance and attachment. After Eurydice died, Orpheus could have concluded that he should move on with his life, since his love or his attachment for her had caused him so much grief. Clearly, she was an impermanent being and couldn't bring him lasting happiness. However, it seems that Orpheus was really stuck on the idea of an inherently existent wood nymph and decided to manipulate the god of the underworld in order to get her back. Orpheus did quite well in controlling his desire while leading her through the underworld, but eventually succumbed to his impatience and turned to look too soon. And again, he had to experience the brutally painful consequence of his desire when he lost his attachment, his object of attachment for good this time. or at least until he died. So completely absorbed in his self-centered misery, Orpheus fell prey to other people who were also possessed by their own pride and anger, and he was murdered. And he couldn't play his beautiful music for anyone anymore and benefit others. One might say that the story has a happy ending because the couple gets reunited, but it's kind of hard to imagine how joyful it would be living in the darkness under the earth. And looking at my own experience, I know that one way that the afflictions are able to gain hold over me is that they'll say something like, "Oh, go ahead, just do it a little bit. One small piece of dessert won't hurt, even though you're already full. Or just one quick look at the news, even though it's not news day. Or one short nap is okay, even though a walk might be better. Nothing bad will come of that." And I'm sure this is exactly what Orpheus's desire was saying to him. Just one small peak won't hurt. However, I've sort of concluded that this kind of nonchalant attitude towards the afflictions is precisely what allows them to maintain their hold over our behavior. Legend has it that the Indian master Atisha, who brought Buddhism to Tibet, would immediately confess and repent even the tiniest infraction of his precepts, knowing that even the smallest affliction can have a big impact on our experience down the line. Therefore, one little white lie isn't harmless, and one small indulgence in our attachment isn't going to defy the law of karma and bring happiness in the long run. This reality can seem kind of harsh if one looks at it from the perspective of punishment, which is how I used to look at it. But the law of karma actually merely describes a system of cause and effect that has no involvement of inherently good or bad or reward or punishment. Do people want to hear one more myth? It's a little bit long. It's okay? Okay, so then this one's called the Fall of Icarus. So Icarus was the son of Daedalus, and Daedalus was one of the most brilliant architects and craftsmen in Athens. Daedalus had a nephew who apprenticed with him, and he soon became jealous of the young boy's talents. Fearing that his nephew might surpass him, he pushed him off a cliff and was banished to an island called Crete as punishment. The king of Crete, named Minos, had heard of Daedalus's talents and hired him when he arrived to build a complex maze to imprison a monster called the Minotaur that was half bull and half human. The monster was the son of his wife and a white bull that King Midas had originally promised to sacrifice to Poseidon, the god of the ocean, in exchange for Poseidon helping him to gain the throne of Crete. However, King Midas had decided to keep the bull for himself due to greed, and in response, Poseidon had cast a spell on his wife, making her fall in love with the bull and want to copulate with it. Their half-animal, half-man child was very dangerous and needed to eat live humans to survive. So Daedalus, meanwhile, had a son, and both of them constructed the labyrinth to house the Minotaur together. When they had finished, to their surprise, King Minos imprisoned both Daedalus and his son in a high tower so that they could not reveal the secret plan of the labyrinth to anyone. So Daedalus was constantly thinking of ways to escape, and he came up with the ingenious idea of building wings for him and his son out of bird feathers and wax. The day of the escape, Daedalus warned his son not to fly too high because the sun would melt the wax, and not to fly too close to the ocean because that would dampen the feathers. So the plan worked, and they were able to fly far away from Crete. However, Icarus became so caught up with the exhilaration of flying that he flew too high, and as you can probably predict, his wings melted, the wax in his wings melted, and he fell into the ocean where he drowned. So Daedalus was quite devastated, but he kept flying to safety, and he set up life on another island. So back on Crete, King Midas was very angry about the escape, and he set out to find Daedalus. Knowing that Daedalus would disguise himself, the king came up with a very difficult puzzle and traveled around offering money to anyone who could solve it. So Daedalus could not resist the challenge when the king came to his island, and he immediately came out of hiding to solve it. King Midas then demanded that the king of that island turn Daedalus over to him, But the king and his family were very fond of Daedalus and instead conspired to kill King Minos. They offered to give him a royal bath as an official welcome, but then poured scalding hot water on him. Daedalus therefore escaped again, but his whole life was filled with grief over the death of his son. So I think this myth contains a lot of lessons on the afflictions of pride and attachment. Icarus became so caught up with the thrill of flying and the cleverness of his escape that he became careless and forgot that he was a mortal, subject to injury and death. His father's advice not to fly too high or too low also reminds me of the middle way principle taught by the Buddha, where we achieve progress on the spiritual path by being neither too tight nor too loose and eventually reach liberation. It's also clear just how much Daedalus's pride caused him to suffer because he often used his talent with the poor motivation of self-promotion, and this indirectly led to the death of his son. King Minos suffered humiliation for lying and not keeping his promise to Poseidon, and he also died a painful death, probably related to the fact that he fed many of his enemies to the Minotaur. So there are many other very interesting and instructive Greek myths, such as the myth of Tantalus, who suffered for his misdeeds in a very hungry ghost type way, where he was standing in a pool of water which was next to some fruit trees, but as soon as he would reach down to drink the water or reach out to get the fruit, they would move away from him. And he had to spend the rest of his life like that. And then there's also the well-known myth of Sisyphus, who rolls the boulder up the hill only to have it roll back down again and again and again, endlessly. And to me, this sounds a lot like samsara. So maybe learn from the mistakes of these poor sentient beings, whether they are mythical or not, and instead develop all our good qualities like wisdom, compassion, generosity, altruism, and commit ourselves to reaching Buddhahood, where we can be of most benefit to all beings.